The stone walls of Čachtice Castle still seem to carry the screams of the past, even though those voices were silenced over 400 years ago. On cold winter nights, the sound seems to echo through the castle's hard stone. If you stand in the old tower where she was once locked away alive, it almost feels like you can still smell it. The sharp, metal-like smell of blood mixed with the sickeningly sweet smell of things rotting which once filled these halls. It's the year 1610, and deep in the dark parts of this castle, a noblewoman is sitting in a bath. But the bath isn't full of water. The liquid is darker, thicker, and it gives off steam in the freezing cold of the dungeon. Her skin, now old and wrinkled, even though she tried everything to stay young, shines red under the flickering candlelight. She runs her hands through the warm bath, truly believing that this strange ritual will bring back her youth, her beauty, and her power. But the young girl whose blood now fills the tub will never wake up again. She was only 16, a servant who made the terrible mistake of pulling the Countess's hair while brushing it. For that tiny mistake, she lost her life. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, known as the Blood Countess. Her name became linked with such terrible cruelty that even the toughest investigators of her time had trouble writing down all her crimes. But before we can understand how she became a monster, we have to learn about the woman she once was and the world she grew up in. Before we dive into these dark and forgotten stories of pain and survival, if you enjoy hearing about the hidden truths in history, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the richest and most powerful families in Hungary. At that time, power meant everything, and the lives of poor people meant almost nothing. The Báthory name was respected all across Eastern Europe. They were seen as heroes who fought dragons, hunted vampires, and shaped politics for generations. But having such a famous and powerful family came with a dark side, which wouldn't become clear until Elizabeth was older. Her family had many cases of mental illness, likely caused by years of marrying their own relatives to keep power in the family. This didn't just pass on their money and power, it also passed on unstable minds. Her uncle Stephen was known for being angry and cruel to his prisoners. Her Aunt Clara was said to practice dark magic, and she taught young Elizabeth about herbs, potions, and strange rituals that existed somewhere between medicine and witchcraft. Now imagine young Elizabeth walking through the halls of her family's mansion. She was a beautiful child, with pale skin and deep, smart eyes that noticed everything. She got a noble's education, she could read and write in 4 different languages, talk about philosophy, and she carried herself like someone born to lead. But in the private parts of the home, she was learning very different lessons. When she was just 11 years old, she saw her first execution. A poor man was caught stealing grain and brought before her father. The punishment was death. But it wasn't a quick, clean execution. It was slow, painful, and done to scare others. The man was stripped of his clothes, tied up, and left to freeze to death in the castle courtyard, while the family watched from the warm rooms above. Elizabeth pressed her face to the glass, staring as the man's skin turned blue, then purple, then black. She didn't look away even when his fingers started to fall off because of the cold. Years later, she told her servants that this was the moment she understood what real power was. It wasn't just the power to let someone live. It was the far more exciting power to take a life slowly, while watching the light in their eyes disappear. When Elizabeth turned 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a well-known military leader in Hungary who people called the Black Knight. Like most noble marriages at the time, their wedding was arranged. But Ferenc didn't mind Elizabeth's growing interest in hurting others. In fact, he might have been the first person to teach her how to cause pain. Ferenc spent most of his time away from home, fighting in brutal wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars that were seen as necessary for Hungary's safety. Whenever he came back, he didn't just bring stories from the battlefield, also shared torture methods he had picked up from both friends and enemies. Their early time as a couple, if you can even call it a honeymoon, was spent in the castle's dungeons, where they tested cruel methods on servants who had upset them. Elizabeth learned how to use hot irons, needles, and knives with great skill. She found out that the human body could handle more pain than she had thought, that a person's mind could break before their body did. But more than anything, she discovered that causing pain gave her a feeling of excitement that nothing else could match. Not fine wine, not fancy clothes, not even the political power memes that many nobles enjoyed. In the first years of their marriage, the murders happened now and then and were kept secret. A servant girl who broke an expensive vase might be beaten until she died, but her body would be quietly buried, and people would be told she left on her own. A stable boy who spoke rudely might be found dead in his stall. The story would be that a horse had kicked him, even if the wounds clearly showed something much more intentional. Ferenc died in 1604, officially from an illness. But some people quietly said that even the Black Knight had grown uneasy with how far his wife's cruel desires were going. After his death, Elizabeth was left with huge estates, a lot of money, and, most importantly, full control over the land and the people living there. She was now 44 years old, starting to show signs of aging, which would become her deepest obsession. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to answer to anyone else. The first time Elizabeth killed just to get blood, it wasn't something she planned. A young servant girl was helping her get dressed and accidentally pulled Elizabeth's hair with a brooch, causing her pain. Elizabeth turned around and slapped the girl so hard that the ring on her finger cut the girl's cheek, and blood splattered onto Elizabeth's hand. As she wiped the blood off, she noticed something that would change her forever. His skin where the blood had touched looked smoother and younger, like time had reversed in that small spot. Whether this was real or just something she imagined didn't matter, Elizabeth believed it completely. That belief pushed her to commit terrible acts of cruelty that would be remembered for centuries. She started with small tests, tiny needle pricks, little cuts, always blaming the victim for something minor. She would collect the blood in silver bowls and rub it on her face like makeup, staring in the mirror for hours, trying to see if her looks had improved. But as time passed, Elizabeth became sure that she needed more blood, and it had to be fresh, still warm from the body. That meant hurting people wasn't enough anymore. They had to die. The change in Elizabeth from a cruel noblewoman to a full-blown killer didn't happen overnight. But it never stopped moving forward. At first, she would kill maybe one servant girl every few months. She always picked girls who were young and pretty because she believed their youth could somehow pass into her body through their blood. She began to form habits around these killings, turning them into rituals. Some of these were based on folk magic that her aunt had taught her long ago. The murders happened deep in the castle, in rooms hidden by thick stone walls and heavy curtains that blocked out the sound. Elizabeth had the girls stripped of their clothes and tied up, then slowly tortured them while collecting their blood in bowls placed underneath. She believed that fear and pain made the blood stronger, so she kept the girls alive as long as possible, sometimes for several days, before finally letting them die. As her obsession grew worse, Elizabeth surrounded herself with helpers who either shared her twisted desires or were too scared to say no. Her closest group included 4 people who carried out her orders like extensions of her own hands. Čachtice, an older woman who acted as Elizabeth's personal witch and advisor. Janos Ujvari, also called Ivanka, a dwarf who worked as her bodyguard and killer. Lona Joe, a servant who helped find new victims. In Catalan, Benica, a laundrywoman who got rid of the bodies. Together, these 5 created something like a murder machine. They picked their victims from the servant girls already working in the castle, or they tricked peasant girls from nearby villages with promises of work. The girls they chose were always young, always female, and always chosen because they were attractive and seemed healthy. The way Elizabeth killed them depended on her mood and what she claimed the girl had done wrong. Some were beaten to death with clubs. Others were burned with hot metal rods or had needles pushed under their fingernails. Many were cut with knives in careful ways so their blood could be gathered more easily. Elizabeth's favorite way was to hang the girl by her wrists from the ceiling and cut her slowly, letting the blood drip down into a bath below. The castle itself turned into a house of death. The bodies were handled in different ways. Some were buried on the property, others thrown into the river, and some were fed to the dogs or left in the woods for wild animals to eat. The lower parts of the castle smelled strongly of death. Elizabeth tried to cover the smell with incense and herbs, but it was never completely gone. Shockingly, this killing spree went on for almost 6 years, without anyone stopping it. The disappearance of servant girls wasn't seen as strange in a world where poor people had no rights and nobody to speak for them. If local leaders noticed at all, They were either paid off to stay silent, or they just assumed the girls had run away in search of a better life. By the year 1609, Elizabeth was 50 years old. Despite all her dark rituals, she couldn't stop time from changing her. The woman once praised as one of Hungary's most beautiful, now saw only wrinkles and age spots when she looked in the mirror. Her need to stay young had grown into a complete madness, pushing her to kill more often and more brutally. What used to be one murder every few months turned into killings every week, or even more often. Elizabeth began to believe that peasant blood was no longer strong enough. She thought that since poor people had lower status, their life force wasn't powerful, so she started looking for victims from small, noble families, young women from better bloodlines, hoping their blood would work better. This decision would eventually destroy her. But Elizabeth, lost in her madness, couldn't see the risk. She began inviting noble girls to her castle, pretending she wanted to help finish their education or teach them how to run a household. These girls, unlike the peasant servants, had families who cared about them, who would ask questions, and who had the power to demand answers. The first noble victim was a distant cousin, a 16-year-old girl named Anna, who had been sent to learn proper behavior for court life. Anna's parents received letters they thought were from their daughter saying she was happy and learning a lot, but the letters were fake. Elizabeth had written them herself after torturing Anna to death over several days. When Anna didn't come home like she said she would, her parents went to the castle to find out what happened. Elizabeth welcomed them kindly and acted shocked and worried about Anna's disappearance. She even said maybe Anna had run away with a young man she liked and offered to help look for her. But Anna's mother saw something that made her feel cold inside. Elizabeth was wearing Anna's favorite necklace, a special piece that had been in their family for generations. People in the noble families nearby started hearing rumors that young women who went to Čachtice Castle often disappeared without any trace. Parents started turning down Elizabeth's invitations. The few who did let their daughters go insisted they send letters often and come home for visits. The investigation that would finally bring Elizabeth Báthory down started by chance. King Matthias II of Hungary had been searching for a way to take the Báthory family's huge lands, partly to grab their money and partly to wipe out the large debts the royal treasury owed them. When reports of missing noble girls reached the court, the king saw a chance. He chose György Thurzo, the highest-ranking official in Hungary, and interestingly, a relative of Elizabeth's dead husband, to look into the matter. Thurzo was careful and thorough. He knew that to accuse someone as powerful as Elizabeth, he would need solid proof. He started by talking to the families of the missing girls, writing down their stories, and collecting physical signs of what happened to their daughters. The investigation took months. During that time, Elizabeth kept killing, unaware that she was being hunted. By the end of 1610, Thurzo had gathered stories from many witnesses, servants who had escaped from the castle, relatives of the victims, and local leaders who had been paid off to stay quiet. The full picture was terrifying. Even officials who had seen horrible things before found it hard to believe. The witnesses said Elizabeth had killed between 80 and 650 young women during her crimes. No one would ever know the exact number, since many of the victims were peasants whose disappearances were never officially reported. But the physical evidence was impossible to ignore. Torture devices stained with blood, rooms that smelled strongly of death, and human bones spread across the castle grounds. On December 29, 1610, Thurzo came to Čachtice Castle with soldiers and a royal order to arrest Elizabeth. What they saw inside would stay in their nightmares forever. The raid started early in the morning, while the thick stone walls were still covered in mist from the forest nearby. Thurzo had planned it carefully, early enough to stop anyone from destroying evidence, but not so early that it was too dark to record what they found. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the smell that hit them as soon as they entered the main hall. It was the strong, sickening smell of death, so bad that some of the soldiers had to run outside and throw up. But they kept going, following the horrible smell deeper into the castle. In the lower parts of the castle, investigators found things that were hard to even describe. In one room, they came across the bodies of 2 young women who had been tortured so recently that their blood was still warm. In another room, they found several body parts from different victims, and these were arranged in strange patterns that looked like they had some kind of ritual meaning. But the most horrifying thing was found in Elizabeth's personal room. There, they discovered her private bath, a big silver tub that looked like it was full of blood. The liquid inside was still warm, and floating in it were pieces of human flesh and strands of hair. Elizabeth herself was found nearby, and her body was completely covered in blood that clearly did not belong to her. The investigators also found a personal diary that Elizabeth had written by hand. Inside, she described her crimes in shocking detail. Her writing sounded like the thoughts of someone who had lost her mind. She talked about her beliefs that blood could make a person young again and described the different ways. She tried to get blood from her victims. Some parts of the diary were so horrifying that officials decided to keep them secret and never let the public read them. Among the worst things they found were the bodies of several young noblewomen who had gone missing in the past few months. Their bodies showed signs of long-lasting torture, and when the investigators tested their remains, the results showed that these girls had been kept alive for many days or even weeks before they were finally allowed to die. Elizabeth Báthory was never officially put on trial. Because she was a powerful noblewoman, she couldn't be punished in the usual way. And King Matthias didn't want to set an example that might later be used against other important families. Instead of going through a public trial, she was kept under house arrest, while the people who helped her were put on trial for the crimes. The trial of her helpers, Dorata, Čachtice, Janos, Uvori, Ilona Rue, and Catalin Benica, started in early 1611 and quickly became a big story all across Europe. The prosecutors brought forward strong evidence that showed this wasn't just random violence. It was an organized and regular series of killings that shocked even the people who were used to hearing about horrible things. Many witnesses came forward and told the court about the terrible things they had seen or heard. Former servants explained how they had been forced to watch while their co-workers were tortured and killed. Local villagers said they had found human body parts in the forests around the castle. Some government officials even admitted that they had taken bribes to ignore reports of missing girls. The physical proof was just as powerful. The investigators had found detailed notes about the murders. There were drawings of torture tools and comments about which ones made the most blood come out. They had also discovered special rooms made for killing. These had drainage systems to catch the blood and soundproof walls to keep the screams from being heard outside. But maybe the strongest proof came from the helpers themselves. Knowing that they would likely be executed, they started blaming each other, hoping to get lighter punishment by saying they were less guilty. Their statements gave people a look into how Elizabeth's murder system worked day by day. Dorothea Čachtice, an older woman who had acted as Elizabeth's advisor, said she was only doing what she was told and had no choice. But others told the court that she actually enjoyed being part of the torture, and she even came up with new ideas for how to hurt people. Janos Ujveri, a dwarf, admitted that he had killed several victims himself, but said he only did it because he was forced to. However, other witnesses said he liked doing it and would even offer to do the worst parts. The trial went on for several months, and during that time, the public completely turned against the people being judged. The proof was just too strong, and the crimes were so terrible that there was no other possible result. All four were found guilty and given the death penalty, although they were executed in different ways depending on how much they were thought to be responsible. While the people who helped her were punished, Elizabeth Báthory stayed locked inside her castle. She was officially being investigated, but really the law couldn't touch her. King Matthias and his advisors argued for months about what they should do with her. Killing her wasn't an option because of her noble rank, but letting her go free would have caused outrage because of how many people she hurt. In the end, they came up with a solution that was both cruel and clever. They would trap Elizabeth inside her own castle by building walls around her. She was given only a few small rooms and had no way to get out. Food would be passed to her through a small slot in the wall, but she wouldn't be able to see the outside world or talk to anyone except her guards. This punishment was carried out in late 1611, about a year after she was first arrested. Elizabeth was kept in 3 rooms in the upper part of Čachtice Castle: a bedroom, tiny sitting room, and a room for praying. The doorways were sealed shut with bricks, leaving just small holes for giving her food and taking away waste. The windows were covered and locked so she couldn't see anything outside. People who were alive at the time said that Elizabeth reacted to this imprisonment with a mix of anger and shock. She had really believed that being a noble would keep her safe from any serious punishment, so finding out she would be locked away forever was a big surprise. At first, She kept begging her guards to let her go, and sometimes threatened them, believing she would be freed one day. But as months passed and turned into years, her angry attitude slowly changed into a kind of sad madness. Guards said they heard her talking to herself for hours. Sometimes she argued with people who weren't there, and other times she mumbled what sounded like spells or magic words. She sometimes said she could see the ghosts of the girls she had killed and would describe them in great detail to anyone who listened. There was a deep irony in what happened to her. Elizabeth had murdered hundreds of young women in a hopeless attempt to stay young and beautiful. Now she was trapped in a place where she would grow old and fall apart without anyone around to even see it happen. The pride and obsession with beauty that had pushed her to do such awful things were now being punished in the most fitting way possible. Elizabeth Báthory stayed inside those walled-up rooms for almost 4 years, from 1611 until she died in 1614. During that time, she became more and more cut off, not just from people, but from reality itself. Her mind slipped deeper into strange thoughts and dreams, and she only sometimes seemed to know what was really happening. Guards who brought her food said she often didn't recognize them. She would speak to them as if they were old servants or family members who had died long ago. She would spend a lot of time just staring into a small mirror, one of the few things she had been allowed to keep. She seemed obsessed with how her face was changing from age and being locked away. Her body started falling apart quickly in those conditions. She got no sunlight or exercise, and her food was plain and basic, which was a big change for someone who used to live in comfort and luxury. Her once famous beauty disappeared completely, and she began to look like someone who had lost all hope. But maybe the harshest part of her punishment was the quiet. Elizabeth had once had control over dozens of servants and decided the fate of hundreds of people. Now, she had no one to speak to except the guards who gave her meals. The woman who had once been surrounded by screams now lived in silence. With only her own voice and the sound of footsteps in the hallway to keep her company, on August 21st, 1614, the guards brought Elizabeth her breakfast and found her dead in bed. She was 54 years old, and from what they could tell had passed away peacefully in her sleep, something she never allowed any of her victims. The official reason given for her death was natural causes, although some people at the time thought she might have taken her own life. Her body didn't have any injuries, and there was no sign that the guards had poisoned or hurt her. After years of killing innocent people in hopes of avoiding death, Elizabeth Báthory had finally faced the same end that comes for everyone. Elizabeth Báthory's death didn't stop people from talking about her. In many ways, her story really began after she died. What she did was so horrible and far beyond what anyone thought a person could do that she quickly became more than just a part of history. She became a legend. Right after her death, the authorities were careful about what happened next. At first, she was buried in the church at Čachtice, but the local people didn't want her there. They believed her body made the church ground unholy. Because of this, her remains were moved to a family tomb in Ext, and her grave was left without a name or marker, so that no one would visit it out of dark curiosity. The castle where she lived was left empty soon after her death. People in the area stayed away from it, saying it was haunted by the ghosts of the girls she had killed. Over the years, the castle slowly started to fall apart. Even now, some visitors say they hear strange noises, or experience things they can't explain when they walk through the broken walls. But what lasted the longest was her story. Within just a few decades after she died, people had changed and added to the truth of what happened, until Elizabeth sounded like a creature from a nightmare. Some stories said she bathed in the blood of more than 650 people. Others claimed she had made deals with demons or used black magic in huge ways. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory spread across Europe and led to many books, tales, and later movies. She became the model for the idea of a female vampire in popular culture, a beautiful woman who killed the innocent and drank their blood. The real Elizabeth, a troubled woman who was obsessed with her looks and enjoyed hurting others, was turned into a monster of pure evil in the public's imagination. Modern researchers have tried to find out the truth from all the made-up parts in her story, but it's hard. Many original papers from her time are gone, and even the ones that remain often made her crimes sound worse than they already were. What we do know for sure is that she murdered many young girls, at least dozens, maybe over 100, because she believed that their blood could help her stay young. To truly understand Elizabeth Báthory, we need to look past the shocking parts of what she did and think about the mental and social problems that helped create such a person. Her story is not only about one woman's madness, it's also about what happens when someone has too much power and no one to stop them. Elizabeth lived in a time where poor people's lives didn't matter much, and nobles like her could kill without punishment, as long as the victims weren't from noble families. The system of rule that gave her control over so many people also protected her from being held responsible. For most of the time she was killing, no one checked on her, no one asked questions, and she didn't have to answer to anyone. The psychological picture painted by stories from that time shows a woman who likely had serious mental health problems, especially ones that affected her personality. She didn't feel empathy for others, needed to be in total control, thought she was more important than anyone else, and didn't mind hurting people just to make herself feel good. All these traits point toward what we would today call a psychopath, and her high social rank only made things worse. But Elizabeth's behavior was also influenced by her family background. Many noble families in Europe at that time married within their own bloodlines, which often led to mental health issues, and the Báthory family already had a history of mental illness and violent behavior. So while Elizabeth's actions were shocking, they weren't completely unheard of in her family. We also can't ignore how much superstition and traditional beliefs played a role in what she did. Elizabeth truly believed that bathing in blood could keep her looking young. Back then, it wasn't unusual for people to believe that certain magical or religious rituals could affect the body. Science and magic were often mixed together in the 1600s. What made Elizabeth different was not just that she believed these things, but that she acted on them, no matter how many people she hurt. She had everything she needed to carry out these horrible acts: access to victims, a private place to hide what she was doing, and a mind that actually enjoyed the killing. All these things came together to make her one of the most deadly killers in history. Over the many years people have talked about Elizabeth Báthory, one thing is often forgotten: the humanity of the girls she hurt. These weren't just characters in an old story, they were real young women with hopes, fears, and dreams. Most of them were servant girls between the ages of 14 and 20, who went to work at her castle to earn money for their families or to gain skills for better jobs. They were usually daughters of poor families, living at the edges of society with little protection. Some of their names were saved in old court records. Anna, who was torn apart by dogs after being tortured. Kata, who was burned with hot iron rods. Pola, who was beaten to death with clubs. These girls were simply unlucky to be noticed by a woman who took pleasure in causing pain. There were also noble girls among the victims, though not as many. These were daughters from higher social classes who were sent to Elizabeth's castle by their families, trusting that her high status would keep their daughters safe. But instead, they ended up in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The emotional damage to those who survived, the servants who ran away, the families who lost daughters, and the people in nearby villages who lived in constant fear can't really be measured. For many years after, just hearing the Báthory name would make people cross themselves and whisper prayers for protection. It's important to remember that behind every terrifying figure in history, there are real people whose pain and suffering made that figure so feared. Elizabeth Báthory's crimes weren't just old horror stories, they were real acts of violence against young women, who had a right to live full lives, to love and be loved, and to help their families and communities. Elizabeth Báthory's story feels like it belongs to a dark past. But the reasons behind her crimes, power, loneliness, and mental illness still exist today. Power continues to corrupt, especially when no one questions it. People in authority still hurt others: dictators, corrupt priests, rich abusers. Elizabeth had total control over her servants, and it made her cruel. Modern serial killers share traits with her: no empathy, need for control, and hiding behind a normal appearance. The difference is that most today don't have the protection she did. She didn't act alone. Her helpers, silent servants, and blind officials allowed it. Evil often happens because people refuse to see or speak up. In her case, many were guilty just by doing nothing. Her story shows evil doesn't always look scary. It can hide behind rich families, polite smiles, and luxury. Sometimes the worst people are the ones who seem the most successful. One turning point was when she saw her own blood and believed it could keep her young. From then on, she chose to think her life mattered more than anyone else's. The sad twist is that her plan failed. She died alone and forgotten. The beauty she'd killed for faded anyway, and now her name is tied to terror, not admiration. What's disturbing is how close her thinking feels to today. People spend money trying to look young. The beauty industry profits from fear of aging. Social media adds pressure to stay perfect. We may not bathe in blood, but we still chase youth at any cost. Her madness isn't so far from us. Her castle still stands, though broken. Tourists visit, locals avoid it. Some say you can still hear screams in the wind, but the real warning is inside us, the little voice that tells us to stop before we hurt others. Elizabeth ignored that voice, and the result was horror. In the end, she did become immortal, but only as a warning. Her life is a lesson about power, mental illness, and the evil people are capable of. Her story reflects our darkest sides and dares us to do better. The blood is gone. The screams are silent. Elizabeth is long dead. But the questions her life asks still matter today, about power, vanity, and what we value most. Stories like hers remind us the battle between good and evil never ends.